How to change 1 billion people. That's what urbanization does. It changes people, changes them from the inside out. Good neuroscience on this. When people go to cities, they walk faster, they talk more quickly, different parts of their brain light up. When they go back to the countryside, if they do, it still looks like that. They have physically changed. They're taller, they're wider. They're city people. And it's a one-way street, it doesn't turn back. There is no recorded instance in human history of deurbanization. So this is kind of interesting. Why does this happen? How does this happen? What impact it is? Where are we at in China? That's what I'll try to talk about today. But before I start, survey says, which country is China? I don't know if everybody can see this. Country A, country B, country C, country D. Look at these indicators. So you've got some economic things, inflation, agricultural share GDP going from 1 up to 18%. You've got e-commerce penetration. You've got some demographics there. The median age at 38, 45, down to 37, up down to 27. You got literacy and infant mortality rates all over the spectrum. As you can see, China is one of these countries, A, B, C, or D. Can I see hands for country A? Anybody believe China's country A? Anybody believe China's country B? Couple of hands. Anybody believe China's country C? Most of the hands. More hands. Country D. Okay, survey says. Country C. China looks a lot like a developed country. All I'm saying is that in some angles it looks like a developing, but actually in many it looks like a developed. So we should kind of stop this conversation about China as a developing country. There are many Chinas and most of them are actually pretty developed. And for the purposes of our conversation today, talking about that transition, we're talking about how it becomes an even more developed country and what does that mean. So let's take you back. 2,000 years of Chinese history or global history. Angus Madison, I don't really have a source for this other than him. I suspect it's mostly demographics, but for most of recorded human history, China and India were the center of the world economy. And then things took a bit of a bump in the 1700s, headed downhill. And since the last 50 years have been kind of on an upstream. So when I show this chart to people like the Undersecretary and others, they don't ask me the question, is this chart right? They ask, does China think this chart is right? and the short answer is, yeah, kind of, they're basically. China should be 20-25% of the world economy, 20-25% of the world's consumers, 20-25% of the world's technology, of the world's resources. It kind of has a whole knock-on effect when you have that mindset. And so why? Why do they think that? Why would they think this is even possible? Well, to what Tara was talking about just now, we've had a pretty good run here, and let's update these numbers. But essentially, over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen this huge push, this urbanization push, which has gone hand in hand with economic development. And so people are in the mindset of, I urbanize, I get rich. I urbanize, I get rich. And it's had staggering impacts. Disposable income up 3 times. 250 cities, triple GDP per capita. 350 million people lifted out of poverty. Never have so many people benefited so much in such a short period of time ever. And with that, all that non-agriculture, that's all non-agriculture. So I was with the Gates Foundation the other day, and there are generations of people who have dedicated their lives to improving the value of life in the countryside who are looking at me with hatred. Because this is essentially saying that's not the answer. The answer is urbanization. We solve the rural problem by solving the rural problem. So this is also, of course, not only a China thing. We look at this globally, so you see the charts everywhere else. US, Japan, Korea, and so forth and so on. So in fact, it is kind of a law of nature. I won't say a law of nature, but it is necessary. You have to be... You can't get rich without being urbanized. Now, you can be urbanized without getting rich. You can't screw this up. But it is a necessary part, because that's what urbanization essentially is productivity. What a city is a high-density, high-frequency environment. So you run into each other a lot, and by running into each other, you figure out what you're good at. And then you do more of that, and that's specialization. You also figure out what you're bad at, and you hopefully stop doing that. But that accounts for why you see homelessness in cities. This is a living lab, and one that's just accelerating all the time. Now, the Chinese were not, of course, the first people to discover this. In fact, my favorite quotes are from this guy. Basically said, we shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us. And so the decisions we make along the way and the decisions China makes about urbanization are going to have some really interesting, perhaps unintended consequences. We'll find out. Once again, it's fun to use the big picture to say, where do we think China's going with this urbanization journey? Okay, here's a map of the world, year 1 AD. Points of light are economic development or economic impact. And as you can see, that's the 20-25% of the world economies in China and India, center of the world somewhere roughly in Afghanistan. Thousands of years go by, wars, plagues, famine, Christianity rises, and so forth. Not much actually changes. China and India still pretty much this. So now you see a sprinkling of light in Europe. Another couple of years, year 1500, again, nothing much changes. And then all of a sudden you start to see stuff happening. You start to see people going from this to this. And as they did that, they doubled their income, essentially. Going from farm to factory was 2x income. That happened, and that was the Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, back at the farm, not much happening in China. So, essentially, as we sort of take that big picture again, it goes from this in 1500 to this in 1938. And this is just kind of an example of how quickly and how fast urbanization has literally changed the face of the planet. So if you were in a camera from outer space, this is kind of what you would be seeing here. So all of a sudden lights going on everywhere else, but not much happening. It's in darkness, and in fact, in a lot of what used to be the center of civilization. That's mostly because of changes in magnification. I know this is an academic audience in part, so they're going to ask that it doesn't actually go dark. No, so we did, so we sized it up by an order of magnitude, which accounts for the relative darkness. Okay, so urbanization in China, then here we go. So does everybody know this city? You've been in this city before? It's this city, same place, Shenzhen. That's 30 years of Shenzhen in 2 charts. Of course, we all know this, and this is my lovely home of Shanghai, which now looks like that, and is well on its way to looking like this. So this is the visual impacts of it all. So on the lighting side, we say we went from 1938 looking like that to 2000 looking like this, to 2007, and the lights are coming on, and the lights are coming on. 2025, we blow this forward, and 2050, it looks like that. And we are kind of back to where we were. So this is the vision. This is kind of why China feels like, as we, urbanize, the lights come on, economic activity takes place, and our society becomes back to the center, the central kingdom. That was the idea. Now, where are we in all of this? We're about halfway through, I'd argue, but already you can start to see the end game. First of all, the spatial outline is pretty clear. This is kind of what it looks like, the big dots of the big mega cities and so forth, and their clusters forming. And there are going to be a few more, but most of the growth is going to basically be infill. It's going to be filling in the clusters. And China will have 20-25 clusters, and they'll all each be the size of a fair-sized European country. And there you are. We're not going to have 10 million person cities springing up in the middle of Gansu. It's not going to happen. So that kind of physical outline is change, and we should have a robust debate about what that means in terms of land. We certainly see a downtick in terms of the rate of urban land expansion. Now, not completely off, and one of my friends would call this a MUD, or multipolar urban development, which is what you look like, what the map of China kind of looks like, sort of splotches everywhere. But it's certainly slowed a lot from the so-called glory days. And the character of urbanization is changing, because as we look back there, and we saw that in the first 15 years or so, most of the increase in the urban population from the 250 to the 600 million came from what they called a city expansion, which was you went to sleep at night as a rural resident and you woke up in the morning as an urban one, because the city had redrawn its boundaries around you, and the 3 or 4 times expansion in urban land area was, as was said, fueled a lot of that. My actual migration, people actually moving, was only about 100 million. That's going to flip. It's going to flip because, first of all, not so much city expansion anymore, and still a whole lot of migration. People voting with their feet by saying they don't want the village economy anymore. This is actually the time period. People say China does this faster. Not really. I mean, Korea probably did it faster. Taiwan, more or less same time. The UK did it in 60 years to go from 28, 30% urbanized to 65 or 70% urbanized. What's different, perhaps, is the economic distance and time that you're traveling when you're doing that. Instead of getting the doubling of income effect, China's getting a tripling or a quadrupling when you move out of the countryside to the cities. So it's just going that much faster. I compare it to me when I was growing up, and the bafflement that my parents displayed when they looked at an ATM for the first time. So not quite knowing how this thing was supposed to give money to you. That is the generational shift that we're having. And so when kids grow up in the Chinese cities, just woefully different context for them and their parents. So who are these kids? Well, these are these kids. These are the migrant kids of Shanghai. It's a school I teach at on weekends. They all think they're from Anhui. You ask them, have you been to Anhui? No. Do you have any parents in Anhui? No. Are you going back to Anhui? No. Where are you from? Anhui. And so, kind of integration, that's the challenge. How do we make China a more inclusive society? Bottom line, that is the phase we're in. We've already got the first wave. Now it's about the second and the third and the fourth. So what kind of problems does China have? Let's start with things like mobility and public services. Public services have a serious spatial mismatch. We did this this data is from the Urban China Initiative, which is a research collaboration I run with Tsinghua and Columbia. And essentially it's looking at the balance of supply and demand, in this case a study on Beijing, of where the people are and where the services are. And there's a really big mismatch. So we start off with GIS data, and all of this shows you is that here are all these public services. And we looked at parks, we looked at primary schools, we looked at hospitals. And you kind of see that they're within the ring roads of Beijing, especially within the first and second and third ring roads of Beijing. Okay, so where's the problem? Well, here's the problem. Okay, red is the supply, blue is the demand. You kind of see the problem, right? The supply is not where the demand is. So that is the basic problem, is that we've grown the population of the city much faster than the public services can respond. And that leads to some very interesting mismatches. So you've got some places darker blue, really good, really lighter blue, really bad. And these are all districts. Actually, we can take this down to the Jiedao, to the community level. And so you have this huge mismatch. The people are not where the services are. It's primary schools. It takes a lot of money and time and effort. Really, educational institutions move slowly sometimes. This one being the exception, of course. So it takes a lot of effort to move an educational bureaucracy. So that's one reason why these mismatches occur. But it's not only the education. It's the hospitals and it's the parks. Same idea. So basically, you get this thing about saying the ideal is the population line, and then the green, the actual travel density is the orange, and so there's an 8% mismatch. The ratio of the shaded area, which is sort of the area that you are not in the right place to get your service, about 8% of the total demand. That's not a small number. What's even more disturbing is that this disproportionately hits poor people. Which is perhaps not surprising, that rich people do find a way of getting their park, or they just take the land. So higher than 2 meaning it's relatively good, lower than 0.4 meaning it's relatively bad. See, low-income people are in the very far down, relatively bad part of this. So this is very regressive, basically. So that's kind of the challenge I see. So now we've kind of built this stuff. Now how do we actually enjoy it? How do we get access to it? Because there's a very high correlation long-term between economic, social, and environmental development. In fact, that is basically the definition of sustainability. These things all impact each other. If you screw up your economy, you're not going to have money to pay for your park. On the other hand, if you drive everybody away because you have horrible quality of life and high crime rates, neither will you have a very good economy. So this is the wrestling that we see right now. So which cities are doing better and how good are we right now? Can the current model reform? Again, from the Urban China Initiative, we created something called this Urban Sustainability Index, which is 24 indicators looking at everything from employment and medical and education, middle school students as a share of the total population, environment, air pollution, AQI ratios, thank you U.S. Consulate, urban density, economic development, quality of economic development, reliance on services versus heavy industry, and finally resource utilization. So we have these 24 indicators, and we look at that for 200 cities across China. And we sort of say, now which are the cities that are doing well and which ones badly, and how big a deal is this? And what we found is something very interesting. We sort of proved the Kuznets Curve, which is that in the early stages of economic development, everything gets better, really, a lot. The urban sustainability index just rockets up. When you're between the 5,000 and the 10,000 GDP per capita level, all of a sudden everything gets better. You put in your water treatment plant, people stop dying. It's a good thing, and you get to hire more more medical and so forth. So, but at some point, all that seems to be stopping. It seems to flatten. We've got a flattening of the curve at the 10,000 GDP per capita level. One thing to note, this growth and sustainability has no significant correlation with the growth of GDP. In other words, cities can actually make their own choices. So what we're seeing is a pattern, but a pattern that's being dictated by a lot of individual choices. So this is the importance of management. There's actually something called managing a city. So how the city chooses to manage could improve its sustainability or not, and there's no particular trade-off here. So the idea that I can't become a better city because it's too expensive is completely wrong-headed. That there is no choice. These are things that you can actually do together. So what are these patterns? First of all, we see the current breakpoint. I mean that urban sustainability, as I said, breaks at about 10,000 GDP per capita. It breaks at about 4 or 5 million. If you get over 4 or 5 million, which was kind of the old model for China was, get rich, get big. Interestingly enough, get really, get more dense to this point about maximizing industrial land at the expense of residential. Get a lot of foreign investment. That's how you get rich. So you can see these things all break at certain points. And net of this is that the cities that are over 10% of the urban population have already crossed all the turning points. And so these are your big cities. These are your Shenzhen, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing, Hangzhou. Perhaps not surprising, but these are cities that basically can't get any more bang for your buck out of the old model. They have to find a new one. They have to find something we'll call an urban productivity model. A more of a focus on the quality of the outputs, less of a focus on the amount of the inputs. So who are the top cities? Okay, yay, Zhuhai. Everybody asks this question, so I have to put it up. So, Zhuhai, Shenzhen, Hangzhou, Xiamen, Guangzhou, Dalian, Fuzhou, Beijing, Changsha, Yantai. And this is people say, hey, Beijing, why? Well, Beijing, it costs you, practically negative money to ride the metro. That is, the society part. So they do really well in society. You do not see Beijing on the environment part. You do see Beijing on the economy part, of course. This is one of the big advantages of being a big city in China. You do see some weighting here towards big cities. In China, generally bigger is better. The bigger cities tend to have more money and more skills and more capabilities. And because Beijing, for example, is a service sector economy by and large, or was relative to, for example, Shanghai, it shows up better on the resource side. Those are some of the top 10 cities, and then just to finish off here saying this is some of the improvers. So you have a lot of medium-sized cities that are also actually doing really well and growing fast. These are the biggest improvements in different phases. When I go to Yangzhou, I show this chart, so they like it. So what are some of the big things that these guys are doing? Okay, so in a nutshell, mass transit. The one thing you take away, mass transit. China's mass transit initiative, 50 mass transits, that's the single biggest impact they can have on the life of the average Chinese person. It's also the single biggest investment in mass transit globally. It is a wonderful thing. If only Los Angeles would follow suit. Adopting a scientific design and mass transit system. Sorry, this is Chinglish. So, the service sector growth, services, all the money's in services. The manufacturing story is done. We're done. It says you can have some productivity, but you're not going to expect to see the same level of income, certainly not the same level of employment growth as you had in the past, and nowhere near what you can get out of services. Urban security now is not a social security pension plans. If you include migrants in your pension plans, they become solvent. Shanghai has learned this. So it was a bankrupt, and now it's a solvent pension plan. So it's sort of how do you get that to happen? Imposing a 27% tax on employers is probably not a good way of doing that. Basically, it means people avoid paying it and avoid contributions. So there's a better way of ensuring that you can actually fund your plan. Singapore, perhaps, is a best practice. Minimum wages goes along with that. Waste management. Waste management is a new industry for China. I think it's representative of environmental sector opportunities. And then with that is emission controls. Big EVs are going to take off. It's not right away. Southern Grid has just put in 6 charging stations. You say, well, that's kind of mediocre, right? Why 6 charging stations? Now each one of them has 250 bays. So those are really big charging stations. So maybe the model will look a little different. It's going to be a lot more dense. It'll be quite exciting. Finally, all of this globalization, we're going to have a lot more events. Every city in China seems to have some version of a horticultural expo. And I'll just close with effectively integrating migrants. Migrants are the future. Migrants are the inclusive society is the productive society. Message, Donald. And look forward to having this conversation. Thank you.